So yeah, I guess maybe if you would just start us off by introducing yourself.
So I'm Lynneth Renberg. I am an associate professor of history at Anderson University, and my research centers on religion, dance, and identity in the pre-modern period. I've done quite a bit of work on dance in the parish, but also quite a bit of work on dancing mania and dancing plagues as one of
Very
the
exciting.
more interesting outbreaks of dance during the time period.
So one thing, I'd kind of like to orient people towards, and I say this as like a historian that works on a very kind of niche old subject, right? Is I sometimes I feel like people think that you get a history PhD and something like this because it's like interesting cocktail party conversation rather than like, useful to something. So I guess as we get into the conversation, I'd be curious to hear like why this subject? Like, what types of questions can a subject like this help us understand better? Um, and yeah, like what can it sort of, I guess, yeah, just sort of broadly writ, like what's the purpose of research like this?
It's a great question, and it's one I have also answered a number of times. Why dance? Why dancing plagues? Why is this your area? Honestly, I think subjects like this are some of the most revealing historically because people during the time period don't actually put a lot of thought into the things that they say around things like dance. They make these
Mm,
offhand comments about, well, we all know don't dance in the churchyard. And within that statement, there are all these assumptions about what is good, what is bad, what makes someone a good person or a bad
mm,
person. How can you tell what someone thinks or believes or what they understand their place in society to be?
mhm.
And in a lot of the texts that we have as historians, where people try to unpack and explain some of these assumptions about right and wrong, and about God and the world, or about the body and how we understand living in bodies, they put so much time and thought into articulating all of these concepts. And yet, by doing so, they hide all the assumptions that they're bringing into a
Yeah,
text. When you study something like dance, all those assumptions about God and the world and bodies and how we relate to each other and what we can know about other people as we interact with them in the world, those all get baked into the text where they
yeah,
describe this weird dance that's happening in their town. And we can get a better insight into what they actually think, even in ways that they may not have been aware
yeah.
they thought, right? We all have biases and frameworks that we carry into our daily lives that we often don't think about because they're
Yeah.
normal to us. So,
Yeah, and I think that's, kind of I understand that answer completely, and I think it really resonates with the way I think about my again, like my own kind of niche topic is that, yes, this seems really bizarre just on like paper, but it actually like we still deal with all of these things. And in fact, like if I can just teach you that like you are not somehow like free of this, kind of way that biases operate and you're, free of sort of a paradigm about the world that you are given, right? And you have to navigate, then good, like you are not outside of history. And sometimes there's a way that like studying these very bizarre seeming things, um, when you make them familiar, it makes our world seem a little stranger. It allows you to sort of see that strangeness in yeah, just the way that you move around.
yes,
So I guess,
precisely.
maybe I feel like the sort of previous answer you gave us is this is just a good entree into maybe some broader context about so like when you say like pre-modern, like what period are we talking about and what's the religious and social context that all of this is happening in?
Right. So when I say pre-modern, I'm really referring to anything prior to about the year 1700. By the year 1700, we've had some pretty significant scientific advancements with things like germ theory, with understanding of things like the circulation of blood and the way the veins in the body work. That mean that really medical knowledge in particular is dramatically different in 1700 than it would be in 1600 or 1500 or even going further back. What period we're talking about for things like dancing mania is a little trickier because we have records of dancing mania all the way back to Greek sources and
Oh,
accounts.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it goes way far back. But the type of dancing mania that we tend to think of when you hear the term, with this uncontrolled dancing that seems to have an unclear cause, might be associated with demons or a divine curse or disease. We really have the first record of that in medieval Europe around the year 1000. It's an incident in a city called Kolbeck in what is now Germany. And we have these dancers who go into a churchyard. It's Christmas Eve. They're supposed to be going into a service. The priest comes out and tells them, come into mass, and they basically say no. They sing louder, they dance a bit more. The priest gets very frustrated and prays that God would curse them to dance the whole year, hand in hand, as they have been dancing without ceasing. At this point, the dance starts. The dancers dance manically, uncontrollably, hand in hand for a whole year. Depending on which source you're reading, sometimes their arms are pulled off and the arms hop in a circle around with them. All of the sources agree that they're not disturbed by rain or snow or wind, kind of the normal things that would cause you to react. Don't disturb them. We have these very vivid descriptions of their bodies sinking into the ground up to their necks as their feet trace a path that eventually just becomes a burrow that they sink into. And at the end of the year, they're cured by a bishop who kind of prays, they're absolved, they're set free, and some of them die in some of the accounts. Some of them go on throughout the rest of their life, kind of doing a sort of false dance as they hop about, trying to find a saint who can cure them. That incident is probably not very historical, but
Yeah, I was going to ask how you distinguish, but yeah, okay.
yeah, it's preserved in several Latin chronicle accounts that present it as a real event, but those accounts are very much associated with saints and with kind of the power of saints, the creation of these cults of relics. The tale itself gets spun off into sermon tales, into saints' lives, into a crusade narrative as a reason why the Second Crusade failed. This happened right before, and the dancers weren't properly absolved. From there, it kind of turns into a tale that's larger than whatever happened initially.
Yeah, okay.
Initially, we're probably looking at some defiant dancers who danced for an impressively long amount of time, right? Probably not a full year, but there's something that happened that sparks this idea. And so that's around the year 1015. After that, we start to have these outbreaks. There's some in 1200, there's multiple in the 1300s, 1340, 1350s, 1370s, where you have these incidents where you have large numbers of people who do something that all of the accounts describe as a dance. And that's key. It's not described as just random movement.
Yeah.
Everyone who sees it goes automatically, this is a dance. And they dance unceasingly. You can't stop them. They don't respond when you try to get them out of the dance. And eventually it leads to either death or cure. The last of these accounts happens in the late 1500s, early 1600s. They don't go much beyond the 1518 event in Strasbourg. But from about the year 1000 up until then, they're not uncommon, which is an odd thing to say about something that involves uncontrolled dancing.
So, I have so many questions that come from this. One is just like a very basic, probably boring question to clarify. So like we're talking about, modern day Germany and modern day France. You've mentioned the Crusades, but what was this region then? Like, because it was not those modern countries. So like, what was the sort of like political landscape?
Right. That's a great clarification. So for France, we do have something more equivalent to France. We have the Kingdom of France. By the year 1000, it's gone from the Frankish kingdom to what we would think of as France. Modern day Germany, it's a number of small city-states, duchies, principates. Technically, they're all under the auspice of the Holy Roman Empire. So technically, they all have one ruler. But in reality, it's a bunch of kind of self-governing regions that all have different power structures, different authorities, different setups for their governments. The lowlands, the kind of area that would now kind of be the Netherlands, Belgium, right? Like they're under Flemish counts, and that's one of the regions where this spreads to as far as the stories go. The danced outbreaks tend to all take place along the Rhine River in the Rhine River Valley. So there is kind of a common geographic space in which these occur that leads them across all these different technical political entities. but they are all also under the authority of the Latin Church, so the Roman Church at the time.
Mhm.
So shared religious authority, very diverse political systems and authority and structures, similar geographic space for all of
Okay.
these.
And so, one other kind of thing that people listening might not really think about, right, is that, and this relates to like how information circulates, is that, you're describing sources. So I definitely want to hear more about like what sources you're referring to. But we sort of take it for granted that like word spreads fast, like so if a dancing outbreak happened in, Indonesia today, I would hear about it in an hour. And I would read about it on my computer, or like at the very least, I would be able to like get a magazine or something like that. But this is all occurring prior to like the printing press, right? Or like, sort of prior to that time. So how does, I guess one of the things I'm trying to understand is like who would know about outbreaks in different places, and like how did that information travel? Because I think that that's something that feels to me like a really compelling part of the mystery, is that this is one thing if you can sort of be like, oh yeah, like, this mania traveled all over Europe because everyone was reading about it on their computer and it sort of like inspired them to do something similar, or they had a framework for like knowing that that was possible. To what extent, I mean, people weren't literate. Like, to what extent did just common people in one duchy of the Holy Roman Empire have any ability to know what was happening in another part? And like, is the river there a connect? Like, I'm just curious, basically, how information travels and in what form.
That is great. That's a great question. And a lot of this is things we can trace. We can trace where some of these variations of the story end up. But there's a couple, I'll backtrack a second and kind of explain a couple key ways that we see this information spreading. Some of it is simply in pilgrimage, right? This is a period where part of what you do has a way to express your faith is you go from site to site where holy
Mhm.
people are. In that initial account, the Kolbeck dancers site, story, right? All of the dancers who survive set off on pilgrimage, and they're all not
Oh, interesting.
allowed to come together on pilgrimage because that'd be too close to a dance. So, according to the Latin texts we have first, they spread out throughout Europe on pilgrimage, explaining to everybody as they go why their limbs are kind of twitching and why they are on pilgrimage. So that's maybe the earliest record of spread is in this pilgrimage of people who were involved in some way in the early event. Second, it's very common during this period to write down stories that have compelling meaning or compelling illustration, and then repurpose them into texts where they can help make that point. So,
Okay.
with the Quebec Dancers narrative, it's initially in these Latin chronicles giving histories of the region and then connecting into saints' lives. It gets copied into sermons, and that's perhaps the most important place it gets
Okay.
copied because these sermon collections then get spread throughout Europe after Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 has ways to help teach what it means to be a good Christian and to live your faith well. And this specific tale makes it into one of the most widely circulated sermon collections in the British Isles. It makes it into a widely circulated French sermon collection. It makes it into German sermon
Mhm.
collections from the period. It makes it into a Maltese version, and it makes it into several Scandinavian versions.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
so you have this use of this single story to preach and teach in all these settings. And that gets to the key point you raised about literacy and who's
Mhm.
got access to these. You're not going to go read it in a newspaper, find it online, right? All the ways we think of as acquiring modern news. But after Fourth Lateran, it's a requirement that every parish must have someone who can preach in the language of the people and
Mhm.
teach them the basics of the faith. So once
Interesting.
you have something make it into a sermon
Mhm.
collection, your odds of hearing it,
Yeah.
absorbing it as an ordinary medieval person, even if you can't read, are actually decently high.
That's so okay. So it like very, not just sort of in a bigger overview context, this phenomena is connected to religion, but like really materially, and like how like the event itself came to be understood and spread was like baked into the religious infrastructure of the area.
Exactly. The
Super
event
interesting.
itself was tied to religious defiance. The event itself is then used as a religious teaching tool in some of its most widely circulated contexts. And it's very much then framed in the context of this teaches us something about God and
Yeah.
about how we relate to God and what it means to follow God well.
So in you said that was in 1080, 10.
1015 is the
Okay.
first, it's when the event's supposed to happen. There's debate about that. It's very fuzzy. Our first Latin texts are more from 1080. So
Okay.
it's written down around 1080.
And so between that first kind of, real event that we have recorded and the one in Strasbourg, it's 500 years. So that's, as much time as separates us from that Strasbourg event, right?
Yes.
Which should give people sort of an understanding of like, it's not, I think sometimes people like, we think about the medieval period and we're just like, oh yeah, it just was all like 20 years. I don't know. We really collapse in like how much time it was. But yeah, so it is the same period of time from today until that 1518 event as occurred or like as elapsed from like 1518 and that first one. So given that like that's a dramatic amount of time period, how does that how does this all shift by the time we get to this 1518 event? Especially, you mentioned that it's sort of difficult or not really difficult, but that like you and other scholars read about that first 1015 event and are sort of like, I'm not sure if it's historical or it just seems unlikely that it's historical. Seems very easy to sort of read into it that it was, something that happened and then really got embellished over time. You know, one thing that I've found very interesting in reading up about the 1518 event is that there doesn't seem to be that same level of skepticism about that event. So I'm curious if you can tell us, maybe first a little bit about like how the source materials change and how your understanding of like facticity or like historicity
Mhm.
changes between this period, and then actually maybe just like tell us a little bit about that 1518 event itself, not until just to sort of like get us to the end of this phenomena, maybe.
Right. That's yes. So I think one of the first things to highlight, you mentioned, we're about as far from the 1518 event as they were from the original 1015 event. I think that's an important thing to note. I don't know that in 1518 in Strasbourg, people looked at what was happening around them and thought, oh man, this is just like those people we heard about in the
Yeah,
sermon. Right. I think to them, this was like a fantastic children's fairy tale that they heard
yeah,
about. And then the thing happening around them is very real and very different and very threatening. And so I
mm,
think that's an important thing to note. We now, 500 years on, can look back and see this long thread and these continuous
yeah,
connections. But for them, this felt like a very different thing. It's not 12 people in a churchyard on Christmas, it's the
yeah,
middle of summer and several hundred people dancing in the city streets. And there wasn't the expressed intent to not go into church service. This just kind
yeah.
of happened. Um, so that kind of lands me at the end rather than the beginning. I'll just start with what happened in 1518 Strasbourg,
Okay,
and then we'll
yeah,
talk about the sourcing
sure,
shift.
yeah,
So 1518 Strasbourg, we have 6 different chronicle accounts that tell us about what happened there. That's part of why this is seen as more historical in nature. One of these chronicle accounts was compiled from the notes and the council minutes that took place during the plague out of the city's secretary. And
okay,
so, whereas the 1015 event, we have these Latin saints' lives and Latin chronicles that are meant to kind of give validity to authorities in the region or to various saints, and then these sermon tales. 1518, we have these texts that are meant to be recording, here's what happened in the city on these days. And so this is
okay,
mixed in with the normal accounts of there's a famine in the region, there's a peasants' rebellion, there's the day to day business of distributing grain. And then you have this, now we have all these dancing people.
okay,
So it's a very different tone of account. And I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that's
yeah.
one of the things that historians can point to. Not only are there 6 different chronicles and then
Mhm.
texts afterwards that analyze and that talk about this, they're texts that are not meant to be teaching tools. And
Mhm.
so that makes us feel like we can trust
Yeah,
it.
okay,
According to those chronicles, they all agree that a single woman starts this event, Frau Trofea. None of the chronicles say why she starts the event. We get that information from the kind of enigmatic figure Paracelsus, who is
oh,
a
fun, fun,
physician and a
yeah,
philosopher and really an interesting character.
Yeah, I'm delighted to see him show up in this story. If anyone was going to, it would have, yeah, if anyone from the history of medicine would be involved, Paracelsus is the guy.
It's
Yeah.
Paracelsus.
Okay.
He writes one of our earliest kind of explanations of what happens in 1518. He actually is writing as early as 1520 about the
Mhm.
dancing plague
Mm.
in Strasbourg. And so there's quite a close correlation there. You have this medical figure and physician writing about what happened, which again gives us some validity. He talks about Frau Troffea, and he's the one who says that she starts this dancing plague because she's mad at her husband. He's told her to do something she doesn't want to do. And so, in defiance of him, she starts dancing and then she
Mm.
can't stop. And according to Paracelsus, this then spreads to a couple dozen people and then throughout the city. And the chronicle accounts all agree on this. You end up with a couple hundred people dancing uncontrollably. This goes on for several weeks. Um, Nothing is working to stop it. So they try a couple different things in their attempts to cure the dancing plague, and we can circle back and talk about why in a bit on this.
Mhm.
But some of the early attempts of the city to stop the dancing are to hire more musicians and try to get everyone to dance a bit harder, and then
Mhm.
they'll stop dancing. That backfires spectacularly.
Yeah, but I
So,
also can I because
yes.
again, I'm just so thrilled that Paracelsus is in this story, and to probably most people like, who are you talking? Why are you so? But like, for a little bit of context, Paracelsus is like, a really prominent figure in the history of medicine. Really, what he was sort of a fringe figure during his own time, and what he was known for, or why he was a fringe figure, um, is that like he was very against sort of institutional academic medicine. So at this point, really control again, like we're prior to the printing press, there was not
Right.
really there was a real consolidation of medical power within universities and kind of out of the hands of everyday people who had their like own sort of medical traditions. And Paracelsus was very, very against that and felt like medicine should be something that was not so sort of cloistered away in universities. But he was sort of derided in the time as being what we would call a quack. Oh, like so all the sort of prominent physicians, or when you just read the sort of very prominent names in the history of medicine, all of them at the time were like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like this old guy is just like, sitting outside of universities yelling and getting mad. But really, the way that he's sort of been memorialized in the history of science is as like a father of chemistry, because
Yeah.
his mode of medicine, it was is actually kind of it was non-humoral, right? So if the rest of the medical system was using humoral medicine, and I'm going to totally blank on the word he uses, but he has a more like chemical approach to medicine, and so and that survives, right? So his work really gets like integrated into what we now call alchemy, which turns into what we know as chemistry. But why I'm sort of going on this circuitous route and why I intervened when I did is that really fundamental to Paracelsus's medicine is this idea that the cure should be a magnified version of the disease. So whereas in humoral medicine, you treat disease essentially with the opposite, right? Like you're trying to balance if you're overly hot, you need to eat cold foods and like stay calm so that your body can like reduce its heat. So what you're saying here of like, the medical sort of what they did was like, oh, these guys are dancing. Why don't we make them dance even more? Is like to me a very Paracelsian solution. Like just do it. You like you're dancing like mad. Like surely the thing that's going to cure you is to like literally be able to dance it out of your system.
Yes, and that's such an interesting connection because that's actually not one of the cures Paracelsus advocates
Oh, okay,
for
fun. Yeah.
dancing plague. So that dance it out of your system cure actually pulls more on some of the idea of bad blood and of burned blood,
Oh,
which
interesting. Okay.
is
Yeah.
associated with this. And it's this idea that if you can dance off the burned blood, then the
Mm.
dancing will stop. However, that idea of more dancing curing dancing also ties into some of these religious theological ideas
Yeah.
because Platonic dancing, there are dancing manias described in Plato, the Greek philosopher, right? And his cure for dancing mania is different forms of dancing mania that then counter this out of balance dancing and
Oh, fun.
rebalance
Yeah.
the dancing of the spheres.
Uh-huh.
And so, in this first attempt to cure, where they try to have everyone dance more, it's difficult to tell. Is it this idea of burning off the bad blood, kind of pulling on like a permutation of humoral theory? Is it this idea of like balancing the dancing of the spheres with more dancing coming
Uh-huh.
from Plato and this very old philosophical thought? Or is it this idea of danced penance, which is another
Hmm.
possibility, right? This action has made God angry. He is punishing you with dancing. And so we're going to use this painful form of discipline of continuous dancing to kind of
Interesting.
commit this sort of penitential
Yeah.
act and appease God. And that idea of dance as penance appears in some of these accounts of these mania that happened between 1015 and 1518, where you have this idea that the dance is penance for sins that might have been committed and offended John the Baptist, right?
Mm.
And John the Baptist is very famously executed after a dancing girl asks for his head on a plate. And so a lot
Oh,
of these
yeah.
dancing mania are seen as ways to kind of, you've offended John the Baptist, and therefore you're going to dance in connection with the saint. And that connection is also made stronger by the fact that a lot of these outbreaks happen in the middle of the summer, which is when his feast day is.
Oh,
So
interesting. Okay.
there's all these possible readings. We don't have enough in the sources to know which one did they think they were applying, but there's a couple there.
Yeah.
Paracelsus doesn't say we should use any of those. Paracelsus sees this as something disconnected from all of those causes. He actually says those are all nonsense. He's got a great line
Mm.
in one of his texts about this where he's like, this has nothing to do with God or the saints. This is a natural disease with a natural cause, and we need to treat it
Yeah.
accordingly. The other cures the city tries to apply align with what he's going to later write down. That is what you do to treat these.
Uh,
So the city is going to, after the dancing fails, ban all music and Lechtvertigen, so light persons, people of loose moral character, from the
uh,
city. So no musicians, no drummers, no minstrels, no woman of ill repute. By banning these people who have loose moral character, their hope is that they can kind of bring the city back to morality and to
mhm.
stability and end the dancing. Along with that, they order all the dancers to be confined either in hospital or in guild halls, and then no music, no light, just kind of darkness and
Mhm.
silence. They're also going to advocate for kind of binding the dancers, tying their limbs down. That doesn't work either. Those cures all kind of go in line with this idea of like curing it with an opposite, which
Yeah.
Paracelsus does articulate in one of his writings. The best cure for a person who's been afflicted with dancing mania is to make them depressed, hungry, and cold.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Yeah.
He's like, that will get rid of the sinful thoughts that might be driving
Huh.
this, that will cool down your body, and then the hunger will eventually like still your limbs as you become
Mm.
sadder and
Mm.
sadder. You'll eventually stop dancing. Um,
Ah, that's why. So, this is, probably a lot of people that are listening to that are like, well, that's not really, all of that that you just described is not medical. It's sort of social cures. But like, that is sort of the important thing to understand about medicine at this time is that like, treatment, we did not go down to CVS and like get a
right,
prescription, again, like Paracelsus is kind of the guy that like eventually leads to, things like pharmaceuticals.
right,
So none of that really exists. What does exist is this idea of treating disease with something called the six non-naturals, right? Which are things like that we would consider lifestyle interventions, right? So, just you need to eat this food and not that food. You need to rest versus you need activity. Um, and so, yeah, a lot of these things that you're describing, don't maybe seem to us to be outwardly medical because we associate medicine so intensely with like pharmaceutical interventions or like, kind of instrumental interventions or surgery. Whereas we're sort of in a period where those were not the medical means of treating disease. The medical means of treating disease were essentially altering the sort of way of life of the patient. And so things like, yeah, like removing all light, um, starving people, like all of this stuff, or like, putting you in hospital. Hospitals were not our hospitals where you're going, to a bright white room with like, trained nurses and everything. They were essentially places to confine super sick people or people that were like on death's door. They were not really places of healing. Um, so,
right.
and so let's I could talk
Well,
about
a
this
couple more
social.
things
Yeah,
to
go
say
ahead.
on that, because like there's like, yes, that's also helpful for understanding kind of what's in the mindset. The other thing that's helpful to understand is that they're trying these cures first because they're cures that will work no matter the cause.
Mm,
So Paracelsus kind of articulates, and you see some of this debate in the council and chronicle records from the 1518 event. 1518 is weird because it's not just like people of ill repute or people of bad reputation. It's not just adults. There are children involved in this
huh.
dancing mania in 1518. And so everyone looks at this and goes, well, this can't just be people who have made bad, sinful life choices, right? These children are too young to be doing these things we
Yeah.
traditionally associate with this cause. And so they're trying these things that are interventions that would work to kind of adjust what's out of balance with the body.
Mhm.
In ways that don't automatically assume there has to be this direct divine punishment.
Yeah, that's
Um,
interesting.
and so things like the cold water, this is
Hmm.
supposed this is like, well, it'll either cool the blood or it'll calm them down, snap them
Okay.
out of it, right? It's this assumption about how the body works and how it responds to stimuli. And oftentimes in dealing with dancing mania, the assumption is the stimuli is sin and the problem is divine judgment. In 1518, the people dancing are varied enough that that doesn't quite hold up.
Yeah.
And so you see them trying these different solutions to try to address what Paracelsus refers to as a disease of the imagination. There are
Mm,
so many people dancing, not because there's a clear bodily cause, is where he kind of lands on this, but because
yeah.
when you see someone dancing, he talks about it like a whistle, that like it's a whistle that gets embedded, and then you keep hearing the whistle over and over in your heart.
Huh.
And he says the same thing happens. The dance
Is that his
impresses itself
a
on your
whistle?
imagination.
That's how he describes it?
A
That's
whistle
such
or
a
a song. So he's using this idea of
fascinating.
like
Yeah.
an earworm, basically, what
Yeah,
we would
yeah.
say. And that's what he says is going on.
Huh.
Um,
Which does sort of connect it to like, there are modern instances of like mass psychogenic illness, right? Which more or
exactly.
less are sort of the same, it's the same idea, right? Like this is not something biological, but it is, in the way that it's like it's not a pathogen that you
Exactly.
consume and that infects you, but that it is a real sort of infectious behavior. And those still,
Exactly.
like, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but this like mass psychogenic illness is something that like still kind of pops up today.
And similarly, today you still start with treating kind of the low hanging fruit, the causes that you could address that don't cause any harm, right? Cold water is not actually going to cause any harm
Mhm.
to any of these patients. But if it works, it rules out what's going on, right? So once you've tried more dancing, once you've tried cold water, once you've tried confining people in small spaces, banning music so they can't have any more of this impulse to dance, Paracelsus has one more treatment that we don't have records of being tried in 1518. Again, he's writing after the event, but given what you've said about Paracelsus and chemistry, I think you'll find this particularly interesting. He actually advocates the creation of a chemical solution that
Mhm.
you apply under the arms and on the
Mm.
affected limbs of the dancers, just in case the issue is excited laughing veins that need this chemical
Huh.
solution to help balance them out.
Yeah.
And so he does eventually arrive at a pharmaceutical
Yeah.
cure for this
Interesting.
if it's not working on all the other ways,
Yeah.
which just shows us how slippery the diagnosis of this is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something's happened. It's something that all the accounts agree is exceptional, but it's ambiguous enough that they're not quite sure how to treat it. And
Mhm.
so they're starting with the things that are going to cause the least harm and then moving up. And eventually, 1518 Strasbourg does settle on divine intervention. They can't figure out any other way to stop this.
Yeah.
That's where they land. But they all agree that probably wasn't what was happening. It's just the
Yeah.
only thing that worked.
Yeah. That's interesting. So, um, why? And I think like you kind of mentioned this at the very beginning of our talk about this, even like the slipperiness of like what dance means, or like what and I think that that's again something that like when like I have kind of talked about this choreomania event that we're doing. I've like talked about this phenomena. It is something that people will ask is like, well, was this dance or were people like seizing on like, is this
Yeah.
something that was being interpreted as dance but was more like compulsive movement? Is there a difference between those things? So I guess um curious to hear, how you read something like dance into written sources. And yeah, maybe we'll start there, and then I also just kind of note that like in both the 1015 event and in the 1518 event, um, sort of defiance is a really important part of what kicks things off. First, we had the defiance of the priest, and then with Frau Trophy, it's a very different type of defiance. It's against her husband, but that there seems to be a real similar root cause. And so, yeah, I don't know if that ends up being a separate question or not, but yeah, I guess first, dance. What is it?
Yes, that is one of the challenges that dance historians face in dealing with anything pre-modern, is that up until around 1600, we don't have extant surviving dance manuals that tell us
Mhm.
here's the steps and here's how you execute them. We also clearly don't have things like photographs or videos that we would use today to kind of unpack and understand dance. However, we do have a lot of really vivid descriptions of dance that survive in texts, either like some of the romances of the period that like describe courtly dance, or some of the sermons, again, they appear everywhere, that describe all the ways in which dancing will get you condemned.
Mhm.
They, in condemning dance or in kind of giving you this literary picture of dance, give us a lot of details about how dance was performed.
Okay.
And those details help us understand why people look at these episodes of dancing and go, oh, that's a dance.
Yeah.
So some of this has to do with kind of the steps that are used in medieval dance. We often think of dance as either something very formal like ballet with these steps that are very difficult to execute, or something like a modern kind of homecoming dance or prom that's almost completely unchoreographed and all these moves come
Yeah.
together. Medieval dance was neither of those. There were set patterns and set steps, but they were often simple enough that almost anyone could execute them. So lots of stepping and putting your feet together, lots of kind of hand-in-hand motions, jumping. Some of these more enthusiastic dances were performed with a lot of stomping and really high knee
Okay.
steps. And so there were lots of these movements that you could look at, and if they're being done in a rhythmic fashion with these kind of patterns of basic movements, they're recognizable as dances.
Yeah.
Something
Super
else that
interesting.
makes them recognizable as a dance is if they're kind of moving in a line or a procession or a circle. A lot of the dances we have records of, they're circle dances.
Mhm.
And so if you have a group of people who are kind of high stepping and stomping and they're hand in hand and going in a circle, you're probably going to describe that as dance, even if you don't have music to go with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting. And I think that, yeah, it's just been something that like I have not really had a lot of clarity on. I'm like I can certainly sort of understand a circumstance where like I would walk into a room and see a bunch of people just like frantically moving, and I'd really not have a better word for it than dance. But it seems like what you're saying is like there would not have been a confusion between those two things. Dance is a really specific word that's being used intentionally, not in this sort of broader way of like people are moving in a way that I don't understand. They did understand it.
Right.
Okay.
Right. It's a comprehensible way to move the body that all the observers look at and say
Mhm.
is dance. And it is both accessible enough that you don't have to have like training to be able to do a medieval dance. So you could have these hundreds of people doing it recognizably as
Yeah.
dance in a way that people say is distinctly different from just spasmodic motion, right?
Yeah, which is so I guess that I mean, because of course, one of the very evocative things is like there's still no like explanation for what this was, and I think as any historian will tell you, it's sort of a fool's errand to like go and try and like what good does it do people in 1518 for us to be like, well, we figured it out. It was like I don't know, a virus. They don't even know what that is. Like it's just not a
No.
useful sort of so you can do it sort of out of curiosity, but there's no real value to it necessarily. But one of the sort of theories that is floated is like an environmental toxin, right? Like so that there was something in the water, but it seems like that it doesn't really make sense because the movement itself is so intentional that something like poisoning or like a neurological toxin would not have probably actually produced the thing that's then being described.
Yes, a lot of the older works on this go with like ergo poisoning or an environmental toxin. And I think what most recent scholarship has agreed is that's actually not taking the historical sources very seriously, right? They're so unanimous in saying this is dance, and medieval sources are not unclear when there's just weird bodily motion. They will
Yeah.
also describe things like seizures or fits
Mhm.
is the word they'll more often use,
Oh, yeah. Okay.
right?
That makes sense.
And so this is too organized and recognizable to be something like a toxin causing some sort of a seizure or a bodily spasm. Um, and we can have skepticism about the degree to which, some of these narratives were completely accurate or embellished for various teaching purposes, but especially in the later accounts, they're very clear this is
Yeah.
dance. This is Saint Vitus, who's the saint who gets associated with the 1518 event. He is also the patron saint of epileptics, but it's
Mm.
specified and dancers. There's not a blurring of the categories. And so to take the medieval sources seriously, we have to acknowledge that they probably know what they're talking about when they say,
Yeah.
yeah, this is a dance that's happening.
Mhm.
Um, you mentioned this earlier in our conversation, but the element of defiance that
Yeah.
goes with a lot of these, this is my own personal theory. I think that helps us understand what's happening here.
Mm.
I think a lot of modern explanation of the dancing mania has landed on like a mass psychotic break in a time of stress. And I think that's when you look at what's happening around these, right? Strasbourg, you have a comet, which is seen as a portent of doom in the end times. You have several years of famine. You have a peasants' rebellion in the region and mass executions associated with that. There are mentions before we get to the dancing mania that the clergy have been failing to distribute food to the people. And so there's mass hunger within the city.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have these factors where people are hungry. It's one of the hotter summers that they have on record for Strasbourg at the time. There's food shortages, there's abuse of power within the city. The conditions are right for people to kind of
Yeah.
just rise up. I
Mhm.
think in my reading of these, what's happening a lot of times is you have a couple of people using dance as a means of protest in a time
Mhm.
period where you don't have easy access to voice and to protest,
Yeah.
right? It's much easier to spin a dance. It is disruptive, right? If you're doing it in a public place, it is disrupting, it is getting
Mhm.
attention, but it's much easier to spin that as not a direct act of rebellion against authorities versus something
Yeah.
like throwing rocks, right? There's a degree of deniability that makes it an effective protest.
Yeah.
But when the conditions are right for this sort of stress, that can easily spiral out of control. And you can kind of see this crowd movement turn into something that was maybe not intended. I don't think anyone ever intends to start a dancing plague,
Yeah.
but is explainable with these medical causes at the same time that there's a clear kind of social cause that
Yeah.
can help drive the timing of them. Because that's the other problem with causation from environmental factors. They're all over the place in this geographic area. They're
Mhm.
spread out, they're sporadic, they end rather abruptly, right?
Yeah.
It'd be a difficult thing to say, yes, it's one common thing that keeps popping up.
Yeah. Um, that's so interesting. I know I think it's really fascinating to think about, yeah, just sort of being kind of maybe pushed to a breaking point and like having this outlet and then that sort of takes over, right? Like, because at some
Yeah.
point it seems like, even if something had maybe started as a semi-intentional act of defiance, at some point it just sort of takes on a life of its own. And that's, yeah, just really evocative. And yeah, understandable. I mean, I think it sounds like this was, a period of profound stress, but also a real lack of power for people.
And I think one thing we have to keep in mind too, causation is certainly something we can't really pin down, and I don't think it's helpful to try to. But I think one thing we can try to hold on to is thinking about taking our medieval voices seriously, both as witnesses to the event, but then kind of interrogating those has biased records. And this circles us a little bit back to where we were, right? The people who record these episodes are men who hold positions of power within either the church or within the civic authorities. And so they have a vested interest in recording these not as intentional protests, but as these completely unexplainable random
Yeah,
events of dancing people
yeah,
that are
that's
cured by the civic authorities and the church.
mm,
Um, so I think we have to hold that intention of this kind of mass movement that often gains momentum beyond what was probably intended, with the fact that there is a reason that these authority figures might record these as
yeah,
more mad and more thoughtless and more kind of unfeeling than they actually were. I think both of those things can be true at the same time.
yeah.
And that's a helpful thing for us to keep in mind as we think about what's actually happening here.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point to make about, historical sources, not just about this, type of phenomena, but like in general, right? Is that when we as historians engage with sources, there's a real delicate balance that you're getting to here of like you have to take the sources at face value as like something that occur, like try not to bring your own bias into interpretation. Just say like, what is this person telling me, and how can I understand what they're telling me on its own terms, with also like retrospect, right? And so like the thing that you can do as a historian is sort of spot the ways that like history does get materially shaped by the narratives that are left behind, and narratives can only be left behind by certain people, right? And so that question of like, how can you sort of like also, that's where you want to use your interpretation, right? So like you want to take the source at face value while also asking critical questions about, well, why don't we have a narrative from Frau Traufia? Like she would have been
Exactly.
the best person to tell us about this. Well, we don't have a narrative from her for all of these really like identifiable reasons. And so how can we sort of use that lack of source and that presence of source from like a municipal authority to ask questions about bias and power, and to take us all the way back to the conversation? That is an incredibly relevant question even today, right? Like when we think about
Yes.
the way that like, you know, recent history, like we are currently creating the historical record that people in 500 years will use to understand us. Um, and it's relevant to ask who leaves behind sources, what gets documented of the bajillions of documents that we are constantly creating, what gets protected into places like archives or libraries where they can be preserved. Those questions are really intimately related to power and access, today just as much as they were in 1518. Um,
Oh,
so
absolutely.
yeah,
And
go
I
ahead. Sorry.
think I think there's an interesting parallel that I think about a lot with things like TikTok and TikTok
Mhm.
dances and these ways in
I
which
was
these
right.
kind of
Yeah,
viral movements are used to communicate these kind of social positions and political positions and movements, and
yeah,
often dismissed as, oh, that's just dance. That's just like
yeah,
kids goofing off. But it's conveying a very real protest in a lot of ways, and very often something that I think if we'd had similar access to look at some of these historical movements, that's what we need to be kind of trying to read, right? We
yeah,
can't see videos of these dancing bodies. We can't ask Frau Trofea now, 500 years later, were you really just annoyed at your husband, or like what was going on?
yeah.
But we can read carefully who's telling us what's important and what's not, and try to take these moving bodies that are communicating things to us seriously, as well as the written texts.
Yeah, I love that connection to TikTok, because you're right. There is a way that like, like I know myself well enough that I have just not downloaded TikTok because I know that I would never get off of it. But I teach undergrads, and of course they're all
Yeah.
just like, and so from me, the millennial, I'm 39 teaching these 21-year-olds. I'm like, what are you guys all doing on TikTok? Stop, like, stop answering my questions that I'm asking you in a university classroom with like explaining to me something that you saw on TikTok. But at the same time, like, it's compelling, right? Like you're right that like it's not just like kids doing dumb kid stuff because like, oh, I saw a dance on TikTok and like everyone's doing a dance on TikTok, so I am too. It's a form of belonging, right? It's a way to sort
Right.
of connect yourself with something bigger. It's a way to communicate
Right.
something about who you are, and like, what like I'm someone that finds dancing I don't know, like you're
Yeah.
communicating something about self. And just the fact that, just because maybe people participating in like viral dances are dispersed geographically, you're right. Like they're still really consolidated and speaking to each other within a close network, just on digitally, right? So that
Right.
it's an interesting parallel to think about like the ways that like compelling, compulsive social dance is kind of manifesting in both periods, which I guess is kind of like a good segue into, um, a question that's probably a good place to either wrap up or start wrapping up, which is, this 1518 Strasbourg dancing plague, is, you said kind of like one of the last ones. Why? Like, what's the sort of why do they go away?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of possibilities. First, you see some pretty major theological and medical shifts coming
Hmm.
in through the 16th century, right?
Yes.
And so the framework within which these make sense either has divine punishment or has penance or has kind of very specific form of protest that harkens back to some of these philosophical things is starting to be challenged and to fragment. Similarly, on the medical side, right? People start to think about their bodies and how their bodies work differently, and that's going to then change the potential for something like this.
Yeah.
Second, dance patterns change. We're going
Interesting.
to see changes in what is permitted as far as social dance throughout a lot of Europe with the Reformations. A lot of these older forms
Yeah.
of
Okay.
communal dance are going to become the targets of Protestant reformers, but also Catholic reformers trying to prove to the Protestants, like, hey, no, we also care about like living well. And
Yeah.
so it's not that dance goes away, but you see a shift away from the older patterns of dance that were so central to medieval community and to life. And again, more fragmentation into kind of regional dance patterns that are meant to reflect national identity
Yeah.
more so than the older ones were. And so I think that fragmentation, where you have this emphasis on no longer shared theological principles, but theological distinctives, and no longer shared kind of social formation, but regional and eventually national distinctives, make it difficult for something like a dancing play to happen because you can't read the same meaning
Yeah.
universally like you could when there were more of these shared frameworks for interpretation.
That's so interesting. Yeah, like
It's
I'm just sort of thunderstruck by how interesting. I mean, like, so it is a real play. I mean, it is a real like medical phenomena
yeah.
that the only reason you're saying it doesn't exist anymore is because like the infrastructure changed. Like the religious, the so like that is
I
just
think
so
so. And
interesting.
I
Yeah.
think if we think about dancing plague as not just a medical phenomena, but also has something that communicated meaning to the
Yeah.
observers, once that meaning's gone, you're going to read the movements as something else, right?
Yeah.
You're going to interpret them as something different. And I think that's what happens. I think
Yeah.
we lose the framework within which we look at these sorts of mass movements and the specific types of movements. We'd now maybe talk about it, oh, they're stomping, right? As opposed to
Yeah.
dance.
That is just really fascinating. Yeah, I think that like, my understanding of this event is like really just completely shifted by this conversation. And
Awesome.
yeah, I'm thrilled. I'm gonna be thinking about this a lot. Is there anything, as we sort of get towards time again, I could just we'll bring you back next year and then have another version of
Brilliant.
this talk because I could just talk about this all day. But I'm curious if there's anything, you didn't get a chance to add that you just want to make sure. I mean, it's such a rich period, and it's so
It's endlessly
so
interesting.
interesting. Is there anything else that you want to just sort of add for people that are listening?
No, I think the only thing I'd want to add, and I think this has come out through the conversation, is that we often look at this and think that's really strange, or how could they think that? But there are so many systems of logic underpinning every aspect
Mhm.
of this, from its performance to its treatment to
Yeah.
its way it's written down. I think it's actually one of those things where if you can understand at least a little bit what's happening in
Yeah.
this, you can really get a much better view into what it's like to live in 16th century Europe, right? And how you would have seen the world. And something I think about often is what are the things in our period that are the same sort of like framing
Yeah.
events where if you can
Totally.
understand this one like thing that seems kind of odd, it explains so much about the way
Yeah.
we see the world and move through it. I can't identify those, but as a historian, I'm going to be
Yeah.
very curious. Like, I wish I could see someday what those things
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, I make my students think about that when I teach the history of medicine, because of course, especially when you're
Yes.
talking about pre-modern medicine, there's such an impulse to be like, well, those idiots didn't know what they were talking about. They were just sort of throwing anything at the wall. And it's like, well, like,
No.
the humoral system of medicine lasted for like thousands of years. Like,
Yeah.
things don't last that long if they're not logical and if they aren't effective, right? So like, let's chill. Like we've had germ theory for like 150 years, like yes, it is like real, it helps us like treat effectively, but just because we've found a sort of new paradigm for understanding what's going on with us doesn't mean that like the version that existed before that is just like stupid, like
No.
imagined, like sort of fantasies. Like these were real sort of systems of logic, as you're saying. And I think um it's just so important. Like the way I always say that to my students is to be like, well, what about our medicine is going to seem absolutely bonkers to someone in 100 years, right? So
Yeah.
like if your like great grandchild's, classmate could time travel to 2025 to like ask you questions about medicine, what are going to be the things that they're like, I can't believe you guys were doing that? And we talk about things like chemotherapy, right? Where it's like, well, it's
Right.
very effective, but like it is literally, I mean, it's just poisoning the body strategically. Eventually, people are going to find treatments for cancer that make that look downright barbaric. But that isn't a reason to tell people today, like, oh my God, you're really barbaric for using chemotherapy to
Oh,
treat your cancer. It's what we have and it works well enough, right? And so if we
yeah.
can extend, I would say like be a response or like a generous time traveler, right? Like go
Yes.
back in time and like really have that same level of empathy and like consideration for logic that you would hope your great grandchild's classmate would have for you when they, and I thought about this a lot with COVID, the way that like people responded prior to, us knowing a lot about how it spread or what it was or how to treat it. Um, I would be so angry if my great grandchild's classmate came back and was like, well, you guys were idiots. Like, why didn't you just do X, Y, and Z? Why didn't you know that? It's like this was a
Yeah.
profoundly destabilizing, confusing, scary event. And we didn't really know. And so, yeah, like the fact that we didn't know and the fact that like not everything ended up being effective doesn't mean that like we were dumb. It means that we were trying to understand something in real time that you now have the benefit of hindsight on. And so I think that like, as for anyone that's like made it to the end of this conversation on YouTube, I hope that's one of the real takeaways is like people in the medieval period didn't know a lot of the things that we know today, but that does not mean that they weren't logical and that they didn't have a really robust and real understanding of their world and, why it behaved or why it interacted with them the way that it did. Um, so yeah, well, thank you so much. Again, this was just like the most interesting way I could have spent a Tuesday afternoon. Um, and yeah, thank you for joining us. I hope you'll come back
Yes.
sometime.
Thank you for having me. This has been delightful, and I am just sorry to miss the party at the end of the month.
Well, we hope to have it again next year, so we'll get you up there for that one.
Brilliant. Next year. All right. Thanks, Sarah.
All right, cheers.